Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of God, who is the loving nurturer of the creation and the all-compassionate. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, wa salatu wa salam ala Sayyidina Muhammad, al-Mustafa Khatam al-Nabiyyin wa rahmatan lil-Alameen, wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. So my name is Timothy Gianotti, and I have the pleasure of being one of Ferial's colleagues at the American Islamic College, where I currently serve as the president. I'm not sure how that happened, but that's where I am, and that's what I'm doing these days. Miss very much my decades of teaching Islamic theology and philosophy and noetic mysticism, and so gatherings like this and conversations like this are very healing for me. So whether you knew it or not, you were all engaged in a pastoral activity of bringing me back to my center by having this conference. So thank you all for that. So I'm going to share my screen, and we'll go from there, inshallah. So this is a project that I've been thinking about for quite some time, and this project has allowed me to really move on it and to try to give it shape and body. And so I look forward to your comments. This is what I call toward a systematic Islamic theology of RAHMA. So, I think that we, whether we like it or not, and whether we are willing to embrace the liabilities of this or not, I think that we need to have a systematic theology. And I don't mean a singular systematic theology that would be politically imposed, like the Mu'tazilites tried to impose their ideas forcibly upon the entire community. But I do think we need to develop systematic theologies so that our thinking about Islam, our talking about Islam, both externally to the wider world and internally to our children and to one another, that is coherent. And so I think that I think that we need to have something that is both revelation-based and rational. Of course, God is ineffable, and God is Akbar. God is eternally beyond all theology and all of our understandings. But I don't think that religion should be ineffable. And the danger of theologies that allow for too much contradiction or cognitive dissonance or legal or ethical discourses that stand upon a foundation of divine voluntarism, the danger of that is that we can never really say that we know anything, and we can never really speak of principles that are or ideas or practices that are good in themselves, and therefore develop rational explanations and arguments for their defense and their promotion. I've encountered divine voluntarism within the Muslim community, and I know that it's not as widespread as one might think from my presentation, but I've encountered this inability for Muslims to speak about ethics, because what is ethical is whatever God has commanded, and what is unethical is whatever God has prohibited, and that we really cannot penetrate the discussions any further. And I think that we need to develop ways that we can penetrate these discussions, and we can talk about them rationally, philosophically, theologically, with something other than a mindless or an irrational or non-rational adherence to divine command and prohibition. There's also, of course, a widespread confusion about legal permissibility and ethical or moral rectitude, meaning that we often think that if something is legally permissible, then it must be morally or ethically correct. And this is a question that goes back all the way to Plato's Euthyphro, where he asks, are things good because they are commanded, or are they good in themselves and commanded because they are good in themselves? And if our legal positions are said to be revelation-based, then how can they be checked or interrogated? And I think that we need to have a theological and ethical discourse that can interrogate the legal discourse and really make sure that we're not just talking about what is permissible, but we can talk about what is right, what is life-giving, what is correct. And of course, I didn't want to get sensational, so I didn't include lots of slides about all the ways in which I think that we suffer as a community from moral blindness. But even Brother Bilal brought one up from the prison, just yesterday, this idea of locks and socks, and how we can sometimes embrace something as being legally permissible that would be an absolute violation of the very core values of our faith and the very core principles of what this revelation is about. Of course, while I think there's a danger in not having a systematic theology, I think there's also a danger in making theology systematic that we have to recognize. There's, of course, the danger of distortion and oversimplification. And we can talk about previous attempts, the most famous of which in our intellectual history might be the Mu'tazila, and the Mu'tazili ill-fated attempt to craft a systematic theology of unity and justice. I mean, at the face, unity and justice sounds quite self-evident and sounds quite, non-problematic. But the way in which they defined unity and justice led them to make claims about God being compelled to behave in a particular way, God being compelled to send sinners to the hellfire, God being compelled to send virtuous people to paradise, and ultimately that, coupled with political power and coercive techniques, led to I think a devastating counterstrike of traditionalists and the Ash'ariyya. Not to say that that the traditionists or the traditionalists and the Ash'ariyya were entirely wrong in responding the way they did, but I think that the result was a deep mistrust of rationality and a tendency to accept whatever God had said, without adequate interrogation and understanding. And of course, just to go back to that, of course, not all Muslims are Ash'arites, and not all Ash'aris are subscribers to divine voluntarism. But I think it's important for us to at least identify the fact that we have had attempts, some ill-fated, to craft systematic theologies in our past, and I think the fact that they failed doesn't mean that the attempt itself is not worthwhile. But if we do that, we have to search for a universal, coherent, compelling principle to organize and systematize our Islamic theology without disfiguring the tradition. And of course, the Mu'tazilites, embrace unity and justice as their two primary principles in their systematic theology. And what I'm going to forward today is something else, and that is the whole concept of mercy. And the need, if we're going to do this, we need to find a universal, coherent, compelling principle to organize and systematize our Islamic theology without disfiguring the tradition. And of course, the Mu'tazilites tried it with unity and justice, but I'm going to try it with mercy, which after this slide, we're going to talk about it just in the Arabic as RAHMA, because I don't think that mercy captures everything that needs to be captured by the term. The case that I make here for RAHMA, is it possible for us to say that God is bound by anything? And of course, the Ash'ari response, and in my paper, I actually quote from the creeds of al-Ash'ari and some of his theological writings, which completely detach God from any human notions of fairness or justice, even to the extent of saying that God could punish an infant in the next world with the hellfire if God wanted to do so, and it would be just, because precisely God is doing it. And so this was a reaction against the Mu'tazilites, who wanted to say that God was bound to behave in ways that to us rationally seemed just or fair. And so the question really remains, is it possible to say that God, subhanahu wa ta'ala, is bound by anything? And my argument here is that possibly, if God is the one who is doing the binding. And so this is not a Mu'tazili recycling project. Rahma is the only Quranic principle by which we can say that God has bound God's self. And of course, we find it twice in the same surah, where we read kataba ala nafsihi ar-rahma, right? This idea that God has written, God has enjoined, God has prescribed rahma upon God's self. And again, we read it again. say, right, peace be upon you. God has enjoined rahmah upon himself. Your Lord has enjoined rahmah upon himself. And so this idea of enjoining, this is the same, verb that we use, that fasting has been enjoined upon you, kutiba alaykum as-siyam, the idea that God writes things that are binding, that are enjoined, that are prescribed. And this is the only thing in the entirety of the Qur'an that we can say that God has written upon God's self. And so what is rahmah then? And in my view, rahmah is really the highest expression of love in the Qur'an. The explicit etymological connection between the rahm, that is the womb or the uterus in which our lives began, and the Rahman, and the undeniable maternal connotations of rahmah are very present in our traditions, right? And so this is in the hadith, and this is present in in the Quran, that we have two names of God, Rahman and Rahim, which come from the same trilateral root as Ra Ha Mim, and which denotes the womb. And so what does this connote? What does this mean for us? And it has to include notions of unconditional love, of nourishing, life-giving love, of protective love, in the same way that a mother is protective, of selfless love, a love that is not broken by transgression. The idea is that the comparison of the divine love for us in the creation and the mother's love for her child is something that is rock solid in our religious tradition. And yet, when we translate rahmah merely as mercy, I think we lose all of that maternal significance of this term rahmah. So in short, rahmah can be understood as the nature of God's love for the creation, how God loves us, and how God is calling us to love one another.
5 minutes.
How many? 5 minutes? Okay, we'll be fast. So rahmah then, of course, is also the very essence of the Sunnah. The entirety of the Sunnah is distilled in the Quran when it says, "Ma arsalnaka illa rahmatan lil alamin." We've sent you as nothing but a token of rahmah to everyone and to everything. Rahmah is thus the very essence of the Prophet's character and mission. And in fact, I think the most challenging truth about the Sunnah. All the other Sunnahs are pretty easy. The beard or the cane or the high water pants. All that is easy, not to dismiss or belittle that. But truly, if we want to be people of the Sunnah, we have to aspire to be a rahmah to everyone and to everything, including a rahmah to the environment, a rahmah to neighbors, a rahmah to people we don't know, a rahmah to people who don't like us. But the principle of rahmah can also be found in the Prophet's words and deeds. And one of the things that just immediately comes to mind, of course, is the idea of loving for your brother what you love for yourself. And of course, this is not restricted to the brothers, right? But this is the idea of that you begin to place other people's well-being at least on a par with your own. This to me is a step toward rahmah, a step toward loving the way God is calling us to love and the way that God loves us. And then if we look at Surah Ar-Rahman, right, the surah really which distills the rahmah, we see that rahmah, it is Ar-Rahman, which gives rise, Allam al-Qur'an, who gives rise to the revelation. It is the rahmah which is responsible for the creation of the human being. It is rahmah which is why we have been given the faculty that makes everything clear, the bayan. Rahmah is the source and the foundation for the mizan in the creation. Rahmah is the foundation for all right relationship. And I think if Surah Ar-Rahman had another name in English, I would think of it as the surah of right relationship, the right relationship between us and the creation, the right relationship between us and one another, the right relationship between the creature and the creator, of course, founded in the gratitude. Rahmah is the reason why we've been so showered with all these blessings, which should evoke gratitude and not denial. So everything comes down to rahmah. Therefore, nothing in our religion, if God has bound God's self with rahmah, and if the Prophet's mission is distilled into that one concept of rahmah, nothing in our religion can be considered outside of the context or the theater of rahmah. Indeed, if we take any aspect of our faith and practice outside the context of rahmah, it can be argued that it is no longer recognizable as Islamic. And I often use this as a litmus test for youth. that, you know, if people come to you with all kinds of hadiths and all kinds of Arabic, and they dazzle you with all of that, with their, you know, clothes and everything else, but you don't detect any rahmah in their voice or their message or their manner, it cannot be your religion. Cannot be. And I think that this is something we need to discuss, we need to think about. The pastoral implications of all of this is that if God has written rahmah upon God's self, and as the messenger upon whom be God's blessings and peace was himself an embodiment of rahmah to everyone and to everything, the believers must seek to manifest rahmah in everything they say and do. And now we're not talking about just mercy. We're talking about love. We're talking about love that is nurturing, protective, unconditional, affirming everything. A love that wants to see the flourishing of the other. So there is no Islam without the rahmah. When we read that God and the messenger call the believers to that which gives life, we can therefore say that the call is to the love that gives life, to rahmah. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Timothy, for a wonderful presentation. I see 2 hands are raised. I see Masheed has her hand raised. Go ahead, Masheed.
Thank you. Thank you for another really, really wonderful presentation. I really enjoyed listening to that. Just one question. If you said that God's love is unconditional, so I suppose you're saying that he loves us, that's why he punishes us. That's part within his love, I guess.
No, it's the only...
yeah, if that is the case, then would you say then that God also loves Iblis?
Well, you know, it's interesting, and of course, in our tradition, we have a lot of interesting interpretation and thinking about Iblis. And so, you know, the one thing we can say about Iblis is that he's a monotheist, right? And so, you know, and he's performing a very essential function in the world. There's no question. And so in the end, can Iblis himself be redeemed? I'm open to that. But the idea is that even punishment and even the aspects of the deen and punishments that for us to say that we can understand these outside of rahmah, that it is for us to disfigure them. That if God has written rahmah ala nafsihi, then the only way that we can properly understand anything, including the harsher aspects of the Sharia and the intentionality of what those are, the only way that we can properly understand any of that is under the canopy of rahmah. Because if we take it out of that canopy, then we're removing it from the one context which gives meaning and gives correct context for everything else in our faith.
All right. I see Ali Reza has a question, and then Bilal.
Sure. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the presentation and the thought and the project, which I deeply your concerns resonate with me greatly, and I really appreciate what you're doing and the contribution. The question I've got like a package of questions, but I'm going to try and just narrow it down for the sake of time. I guess at the core of it, so I completely agree with you that this the lens of rahmah to engage with these questions is very productive. And, you know, Colin referred to it as effectively the face of Allah, you know, or offered that as a possible interpretation. And there's no doubt that rahmah is presented as this overriding quality of God, and the references which you gave are so central. And this offer a means for us to use it as a litmus test. And if the project is about bringing God, you know, more centrally into our lives, then the conception of God, which we're bringing into the center of our lives is pivotal. How do we frame that? So rahmah as this face, if you like, is absolutely key. So I'm absolutely on board. I guess some of the more difficult questions for me, and which resonate with the challenges that the Mu'tazili faced, or contemporary Shias face, who still maintain this emphasis on unity and a particular conception of justice, is what is the conception of rahmah that we're going to apply as a litmus test, and how is it sourced, right? Because these are ultimate challenges when it comes to bringing in conceptions of God's justice to our appraisal of God's acts or God's Sharia as being just, right? So I think it's easy for people to be on board to say that God is qualified Rahma. His actions are qualified by Rahma. Therefore, his Sharia must be qualified by Rahma. Right? But now if we want to test a particular interpretation or understanding of God's religion, say, is this a manifestation of Rahma or not? How are we conceptualizing Rahma? So the way that you presented it was that Rahma seems to be something which intuitively humans can grasp independent of revelation, or is it dependent of revelation? If it's dependent, we might fall into the same trap and I would call it a trap, and forgive me, that some of the Asha'ira have fallen into, that they're saying that, look, and if the text suggests that, I don't know, a woman shouldn't have an equal right to divorce despite being beaten and raped and so on and so forth, this is an instance of Rahma. Okay, so that's just one example because the text says so, right? So you're nodding, so I'm sure you've got my question, and I would love to hear your kind of thoughts and responses.
No, these are great questions. And so, there has to be, let's say, a deep etymological study of the trilateral root of Rahm. There needs to be a study of that, not just in the Qur'an, but in the, in the pre-Islamic poetry, and to have a deep sense so that we can make that connection very, very clear. But we are aided by the fact that there are numerous explicit connections between God's love and the love of the mother. And so we are given a this worldly referent, let's say. And granted, not everybody has a good experience with their mother. So in Christians who have bad experience with their fathers run into the same problem with the portrayal of God as a father. But the idea is that we are given a whole array, let's say, of attestations and comparisons of God's love to the love of the mother. And so we at least are given this worldly referent by which to deduce what this rahmat must and might look like. And so I think that when it comes to the application of, let's say, the more severe aspects of the Sharia, I think that it has to be interrogated. It has to. We cannot always assume that something which is legally permissible is going to be ethically correct. The last thing, let's say, a depressed or sickly spouse needs is another spouse who's 10 years younger in the house to, what kind of affirmation of worthiness is that? And I think that we are, as a community, we don't really have the tools to fully interrogate what is legally permissible according to the inherited traditions, and to interrogate that in the lens of Rahma. And so I think that interrogation is critically important. And so if it feels like something is a violation of Rahma, it probably needs to be interrogated, and it needs to be looked at. And I think we owe it to ourselves, to our children, to our community, to the world. We owe it to all of them to develop tools by which we can interrogate, the legal discourse, which sometimes feels bankrupt or devoid of rahmah. And so, otherwise, how can I respond to my children? They'll ask me, the Daesh, the Islamic State. So those guys are Muslims, right, Ba? And then you take a deep breath and you try to, how do I explain this contextually? And what is obviously patently a violation of everything I believe Islam to be, right? And so these are, I think that we need to develop these tools. Sorry, it's a long answer and maybe not satisfying, but it's a great question, Ali Reza. Thank you.
Okay. I see Bilal has a question, and then Saifuddin.
Yeah, quickly. First of all, I thank you. I think that this needs to be more of a pastoral theology, other than like a systemized one. The reason why that I also think it needs to be able to hold the possibility for as like said for things to be have hold true for both sides. There'll be like a glute like theory there. And the reason for this is quite often as a chaplain, I am called in to give care to somebody who is on like death row. They have like 6 months or 6 weeks before they are being executed. And quite often, like imams, if there's a known that they've caused like a public harm, they refuse to even like bury them. There's no masjid that will accept them because of the public harm. So a chaplain will have to come in and offer rahma into a particularly contradiction. This person who has warranted and has done a lot of like public harm, and quite often, I have worked in a prison for 5 years where it was a rahma for me not to do one-on-one pastoral work because it was a trigger. This prison that I worked in for 5 years was a prison particularly around like rape, those who were like rapers or those who did like sexual like offense. And so I had a family member who was raped young, a cousin of mine who was murdered and killed after being raped. And so for my own mercy, I refused to do a one-on-one, but it was a rahmah to myself. I still had to serve in this institution or like a very caring way, but for my own heart, I could not do one-on-one. So there's a contradiction there too of like giving care, but yet caring for yourself and knowing those like boundaries. And then lastly, I think this shows up in the Qur'an twice, where Allah Ta'ala like says, to our beloved, prophet, like you are going to worry yourself to death about these people. Guidance is for me. Like the prophet's grief and concern and rahma, but Allah's warning him, do not grieve yourself to death. Don't cause yourself harm and grieving over them, because their guidance is left, for me. So we have to hold space.
Okay, I do want to give time to the answer and a couple of other questions. Well, thank you.
No, it's a powerful. I mean, this is a long conversation, Brother Bilal, and so, but I think you're right. I mean, the call to rahma is also a call to have rahma for ourselves, right? And so that's self-care has to be part of that holistic embracing of rahma. But we can this is a big conversation. Thank you, brother.
Saifuddin had a question. Do you still have a question, Saif?
Yes, yes, thank you very much, Faria. Thank you.
Yeah.
And I'd like to thank also Bilal, because it's a whole theoretical concept, theological. He just gave us a stark example of it, how it can be challenging to implement it. So Timothy, I really enjoyed the talk, and especially the bringing rahma as a very important concept. But I'm a bit disagreeing with you. I have to disagree with you in the initial part, the historical part, because I think I consider myself more historian. I think we should try to be just in our understanding, because of course what Mu'tazila did was very brutal oppression. We should disown ourselves, disassociate ourselves. But also I think it was for their side, it was a reaction to traditionalist oppression, that they were aligning themselves with the Umayyads. And we have the examples of Jad bin Dirham and Jahm bin Safwan brutally murdered. I think, again, going back to Ali Riza's talk, that this understanding of humility, that, knowing we might be wrong, rather than having these strong views and then attacking, I think we should try to revisit our history and also try to get rid of these kind of extreme reaction to opinions. I think that's I just wanted to clarify.
Okay, there wasn't time to go into the, the origins of the Mu'tazila, and I think actually a lot of what the Mu'tazila did was brilliant, and I think also, I'm sure that they were also concerned about the Christological problem, and that's one of the reasons why they had to think about the attributes of essence versus the attributes of fi'al, and create a way that the speech, that we wouldn't fall into that Christological trap. And so I think there's a lot of wisdom in what they tried to do. But I just want to make sure, do you think in arguing for a systematic, or if Brother Bilal wins the day, a pastoral theology of Rahma, do you feel like that is the enforcing of opinion upon the kind of the unnatural imposition of an opinion upon the religion of Islam, or do you think that this is something which is Quranically and prophetically justified and anchored?
Well, we all make mistakes, we think certain idea. I'm not talking about the ideas, theologies, but I'm just kind of reacting to the way that some in the past, in the early history, that Muslim scholars reacted so harshly, that created this mess. It's not just Mu'tazila, because you said Mu'tazila it was a reaction to Mu'tazila. Of course, there's that reaction, but I think we should look at the whole picture, that we are the Muslims, that in the history we made some mistakes. And we're making and
we're making mistakes now. I think, and this is one of the reasons why it doesn't have to be, let's say, a theology of Rahma, but as I'm searching for a universal principle that doesn't disfigure anything when it's applied, and that is absolutely Quranically founded, I think that this may be one of our best opportunities to think systematically about a principle which should touch every aspect of our life, law, and thought. So that's all. But you're right. I think that epistemological humility is something that we all should espouse, and that's why I'm not arguing for one absolute systematic theology, but I do think we have to make Islam coherent, and we have to have some rudder or some criterion by which we can say that's just that can't be right. So anyway,
I fully agree with you. Yes.
Okay. Do we have time for one more question? I think Saf had a question.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you. I was just going to say, I think we might have a challenge if we foreground a single attribute for constructing systematic theology. If I'm understanding systematic theology in its assumed sense. And so, to use the language of the fuqaha, if we're going to have a qa'idah, we're going to need some dawabit. So we're going to have to set out how we're going to govern the operation of Rahma if we're going to foreground it for systematic theology. So I think that journey, we're going to have to work it out. And while we do that, unfortunately, there's going to be a lot of assumptions and presuppositions that will creep in, and then explicating that is going to be another issue. So it's going to be it looks like it's going to be a very layered and involved systematization project. So all the assumptions, presuppositions, even the fact that we're foregrounded in Rahma, is itself based on a kind of assumption that, even though we use a Quranic example, but, like everything, the divine also comes with a package of attributes. And the divine in context, foregrounds certain attributes over others. So I'm just thinking, I can't wait to see it, being a trained in systematic theology myself, but I would love to see how the project pans out.
It's big, and I think this is just really this chapter will just be a prologue, right? And to a project which is very big. It's just that as I wade through the attributes, I see that this is the only one that is spoken of in this particular way in the Qur'an, and this idea of that God writing it ala nafsihi. This is very powerful Quranic legal language, right? This is, and it's the only indication we have in the Quran that God is bound, right, by anything. And so there is a uniqueness about the Rahma. It's not a haphazard selecting of Rahma out of the list of the attributes. In fact, it may be that because of this statement, we have to understand all of the attributes through the lens of rahmah because of these Quranic statements. So it may not be a perfect project, but I think that it's worth attempting, and it certainly has pastoral implications.